Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. After weeks of media hysterics and official claims without a shred of evidence, the case that Russia was behind the Salisbury poisoning incident is falling apart. Transparency and the rule of law have never played a role. It has always been about politics and a pernicious agenda. What happens next, sadly, is only too predictable. Cross-talking toxic politics, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He's the editor of Politics First magazine. Also in London, we have Alexander Nekrasov. He is a political commentator and a former Kremlin advisor. And in Plymouth, we cross to Patrick Henningsen. He is a journalist, writer, and founder of the news website 21stCenturyWire.com. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Alexander, let me go to you first in London. You know, so much is happening. I'd like to point out that Yulia is actually spoken to the media. Apparently, she had a phone call with her sister in Russia, and she's not giving up very much. But I have to say, what a miraculous recovery from, if we start from the beginning of the story, you know, and toxic agent 10 times worse than VX and on, seeing how the media has changed its story. The government has been stonewalling. There's been no transparency whatsoever. There's no cooperation cooperation with Russia that is asked to be part of the investigation. I mean, just stonewalling here. Go ahead, Alexander.
Well, Peter, first of all, what I find completely bizarre is that practically from day one, all of the British media, all of it, I stress, have been covering this story in exactly the same way, sometimes in exactly the same words and phrases. Now, I'm sorry, but how does that, you know, free media work here? Who is giving the instructions? Who is giving the orders? Because I find it very difficult to imagine how, let's say, you know, 100, 200, 300 journalists report in exactly the same way and basically guess most of the things that are happening and provide no proof at all. I thought that was very strange. Secondly, what I found absolutely bizarre is that we were told right from the start that this was a supposedly a nerve agent, military-grade nerve agent, which for some reason was called Novichok, which was, by the way, Novichok was never developed in the Soviet Union. It was something that was invented in America. But if that was a military-grade nerve agent, right, by now, both the Skripals and the policeman who supposedly saved their lives would be long dead. There is no way they would have survived.
But
so that point somehow missed all the attention of the media.
Well, it seems like a miraculous recovery here. Let me go to Marcus. It seems to me that Boris Johnson, the foreign secretary, he's suffering from Porton Down syndrome, okay? Because what is his story? We have tweets being deleted at the foreign ministry here. He was categorically informed that this was a nerve agent that came from Russia. And, of course, we find out that is not true. Why does he still have his job, Marcus?
Well, Boris Johnson is completely and utterly inept. And whilst there are calls for him to resign over his statements on what happened in Salisbury, of course, he is not going to resign, because if he resigned, that would be an admission of guilt on his behalf. And of course, the British government's case against Russia over Salisbury would be all the more weakened. But also, Theresa May is not going to sack him, because if she did sack him, then that would initiate a very, very vicious response from the right wing of the Conservative Party, because the right wing of the Conservative Party is very supportive of Boris Johnson. So regrettably, Boris Johnson is not going anywhere. But that said, even if he was to resign, even if he was to be sacked, his successor would keep to the same narrative. Right. And if I can very quickly just set the scene, anyone who's familiar with the history of Anglo-Russian relations was not surprised by how within a few hours of the tragic event in Salisbury, the British government and British mainstream media were blaming the Russian state. Because ever since diplomatic relations were established between London and Moscow in 1595, Russia has been viewed in Whitehall and Westminster as almost the devil incarnate. Over 500 years or so, the ground has been set in Britain to make any accusation against Russia by a British politician or a British mainstream journalist, and they don't need evidence to back it up.
Yep. You know, Patrick, you know, Marcus used the term the case against Russia. What is the case here? All I can see is on the international stage is a lot of elbowing, a lot of pressure being put on. When we had with the OPCW decision, if you look at the membership, it has a global membership, but it was the people that wanted to make sure that Russia wasn't part of the process, either are in NATO or in the European Union. Latin America and Asia, they didn't go along with it at all. It's intensely politicized. And so what is the case? Because I haven't been given any evidence yet, okay? But it seems like it's already gone to trial, and the same people that brought it to trial are the jury. Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, it's a curious case. Imagine the prosecutor makes the accusations against the defendant, but won't allow the defendant to see the evidence and is presumed guilty straight out of the gate. It's absolutely incredible. But, you know, let's look at this. Where did this term Novichok come from? And this is really interesting, and this is something that's kind of casually glossed over by the media. There's very little evidence of any program or anything called Novichoks, even back to the Soviet Union chemical weapons research and development days. So what it is a GV class, which is a 230 to 260 of agents. And the reason this term Novichok has been thrown out, I think people need to look at this, it is to deflect from the fact that, which your first guest pointed out, Alexander, the United States is the only one to develop this at Edgewood Proving Grounds, the United States Army's biological and chemical weapons proving grounds in Edgewood, Maryland, in 1998. This was published in NIST, okay? So the United States, for this class, which is not a Novichok, Novichok was a term invented by a Russian defector who published it in his book in 2008. So this is a really important point because it deflects from the fact that the United States itself is the one nation on record who has developed and worked on this class of nerve agents that is publicly known.
You know, Alexander, to date there has been no transparency, just accusations. Unfortunately, I have to believe that we're not going to ever get any evidence whatsoever. It'll always be shrouded, and it will because this is really not about the attack or apparent attack on two people, one a former double agent and his daughter, but this is about pushing forward an agenda, a very nefarious one at that. Because I don't see, this is just one step in a process, okay? And so this is why I don't think we'll ever get any kind of transparency on this case. Go ahead, Alexander.
Well, as you know, Peter, 15 years ago, another prime minister stood up in the Commons and made up allegations about chemical weapons against Iraq, and also quoted intelligence agencies and said he can't reveal the details. And then the war happened, and 1 million people or more died, and so on. And we still don't know anything how it worked. So I think we're in a similar situation now with another prime minister. I think, to be honest with you, Peter, I think there is no nerve agent.
I agree.
There was no nerve agent over there.
Until you give me any evidence.
They're making up.
Give me evidence. I agree. Go ahead.
And you know why I say this? Because when I watched that Porton Down chief executive giving his take on this so-called Novichok, and I felt that the reason why he said we can't trace it is because there is none. I mean, what do you mean? What did he mean we can't understand where it came from? If they are the top professionals, of course they could have told that. There is nothing for them to examine. And when I saw those, you know, Porton Down boys dressed up in those fancy defensive gear, walking around, and around them passers-by and cops were looking at them, you know, with interest. I thought, this is a fancy dress party. They're just making it look as if there is something there.
It's certainly good for the. It's certainly good for the cameras, isn't it? Okay, Marcus, let me go to you. Jeremy Corbyn is being pillared for this as well, and I find that's a very. I mean, because there's so many elements. As we have NATO, we have the European Union, we have Brexit, and we have the Labour opposition, and they're turning this full blast against him in a very shameful. I'm a conservative. He's way to the left of me, but what the media is doing to him is shameful. Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, ever since Jeremy Corbyn became an MP in 1983, he has consistently called out British foreign policy. He's consistently called out American foreign policy. He has consistently challenged British mainstream media. And history shows that he has been correct. He was correct about what happened in the former Yugoslavia. He was correct about what happened in Iraq. He was correct about Libya. He was correct about Ukraine. And he was correct about Syria. But what I believe is all the more frightening about how British mainstream media is treating him is the level of abuse.
Yep. Because
yes, they have tackled him over the last 30 odd years, but the personal abuse against him is absolutely horrific, being called a traitor, being called a Putin apologist. This is not something which should be tolerated in Britain, because after all, Britain is supposed to be a democracy. There is supposed to be rule of law. There is supposed to be respect in British politics. But when it comes to Jeremy Corbyn, none of that is there. And we have to ask, why is that the case? Right. It's very, very simple, Peter, because Jeremy Corbyn terrifies the British establishment. He terrifies the British government.
He's a genuine
He terrifies
threat.
British mainstream media. They don't want him to be Prime Minister. He's a genuine threat to them, and also he's a genuine politician. He's a genuine human being, and regrettably,
Marcus,
there's not many people like him in politics in the world.
I'm going to jump in here, gentlemen. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on toxic politics. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing toxic politics. Let's go back to Plymouth. Patrick, kind of give us the lay of the land when it comes to international politics. I'm thinking about the EU, Brexit, and NATO here, because I think these are very important pieces that they're trying to bring into this story here. Basically trying to keep some semblance of unity when it is flagging. Everyone knows that. Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, well, the dogs were unleashed yesterday in the British press on Theresa May and Boris Johnson. So they, in a way, they've kind of sprung their own trap in this sense. So it's possible that if the establishment wanted to bury the embarrassment of the Novichok hoax or the Novichok story, that May and Boris could very well be eventually buried with that or attached to that. But then on the other hand, the breaking ranks in Germany, Angela Merkel's, one of her close deputies, has come out and basically criticized Britain for invoking this kind of solidarity of faith between the EU or NATO member states to sort of accept some sort of presumption of guilt on the basis of no evidence at all. So Willy Wimmer, the former vice president of the OECD, he put this very well. He said this threatens to undermine these very multilateral institutions. In other words, if you cry wolf this time, you might not be able to actually do it again. They're already on thin ice, as you mentioned earlier, with regards to Libya and so forth. So this is really risky. In terms of evoking this kind of stand with your allies mantra, this is kind of the overriding theme so far we've seen, with the United States doing as well, coming in right behind Britain on this, as well as its NATO partners. So that's how it looks geopolitically. You know,
Alexander, I found it really quite extraordinary looking at the U.S. State Department spokeswoman just taking Theresa May's word. I mean, you don't do that in international politics. You don't do it when the stakes are so high like this. It is just the lack of professionalism terrorism, and it adds to the perception that this is some kind of agenda that's being played out here. And it also, and if we could go back to the UK here, I mean, with Brexit in chaos here, it looks like the May government is trying to find unity, you know, accusing Russia, changing the narrative here and trying to rebuild her strength in the polls, which are flagging. Go ahead, Alexander.
Well, what I find completely puzzling is that this anti-Russian stance by the May government is not popular amongst the British public. I can see that by the comments on social media.
Yep.
I meet a lot of people who recognize me on the streets because they see me on television, and they tell me they don't believe May and her government. And this is what I find completely puzzling as regards this sort of public relations exercise. But my opinion, Peter, is that I think they're trying to bury Brexit. I think that what they're doing is they're trying to create this so-called threat to Britain coming from Russia. They say the war has been brought to our territory by Russia. An act of war has been taking place. I think what they're going to do, they're going to basically cancel Brexit and say, in the light of such dangerous situation, we'd better stick with our allies, and we better, well, if not cancel Brexit, but extend the transition period, which is a devastating transition period, because it was negotiated in a way that I find it's completely incompetent from the position of the British government. And don't forget, Peter, there are many, many other serious problems and scandals in the background, including the pedophile scandals, the corruption scandals with huge corporations on government contracts suddenly going bankrupt, and many, many others. So I think it suits Theresa May's government to have some sort of a huge, huge distraction, and this is used as a distraction. And what they're missing, the ministers in her government, is that they are not getting popular with the British public. That's the most amazing thing.
Marcus, what is amazing also is that blaming Russia, I don't care where you are in the Western world. Oh, Russia meddled in the election in the U.S. and gave us Trump here. Russia meddled in Brexit. That's why it happened here. We go down the list of so many different things. It is the most convenient distraction you can come up with, because the media is completely in on it. The elites really like it because the people in the Western world demand change, and they're not being given it. They're being told national security trumps their democratic rights and expressions. Go ahead, Marcus in London.
Well, Peter, whilst I'm not downplaying the significance of what's happened in Salisbury, because it is very serious, however, it is part and parcel of, historically speaking, a very troublesome, a very problematic relationship between Britain and Russia. As I said at the beginning of this programme, for 500 years, Britain and Russia have viewed each other with mutual suspicion, mutual hostility, mutual bitterness. This is Salisbury is part and parcel of this relationship. But if I can very quickly just take us back to Salisbury, you know, the conclusion of British scientists that they cannot determine the source of the alleged nerve agent is absolutely devastating to the British case against Russia. But that said, within 24 hours, the same scientists said that they have now discovered the source. Well, what a remarkable turnaround of events. You know, I'm really sure that no pressure was put on them. You know, in the words of Tommy Cooper, it happened just like that.
Just like that. Yeah, that's right, exactly. Patrick, what is the purpose of all of this? I mean, do they expect Russia to say admit guilt, to say sorry? I mean, and then we have Theresa May saying there will be a proportional response. What does that mean? Are they going to poison someone in Moscow? I mean, what it is it's so much bluster here. I don't see it as a very focused thing. I mean, what is the outcome that they want? Because if the Russians are not allowed to be part of the process in international organizations, not just bilaterally, but in international organizations, you know, what is the point of having these organizations and investigations if all of the players under international law cannot participate? Go ahead.
Yeah, and there's a lot going on here, obviously, on many different levels. But I think I'll pick up on your last point. You just looked at the emergency meeting with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and a roll call vote was taken. And it was well, there were 17, I believe, abstentions.
Right.
So in total, 23 countries either voted against the UK and the US position and sided effectively with Russia. So it's not the world, it's NATO versus Russia. And I think there's a lot of pressure put to bear on some of those countries behind the scenes. You have UN Ambassador Nikki Haley threatening to be taking names if the vote doesn't go their way. We've seen a record of this, undermining multilateral institutions, undermining international relations. And the last thing I'll say is that the propaganda has been so thick in the United States and Britain that we have a situation now, Alexander, your guest, pointed out very correctly that the majority of the British public probably don't buy this official conspiracy theory, but we have a situation where the ruling class are actually a victim of their own propaganda over decades, that many of them in Westminster actually believe this. I'll probably ask Marcus, what does he think? How many MPs actually believe in the conspiracy theory or are being held in a whip line? That would be my question. I'd throw to Marcus.
It's a great question, Marcus. What do you think?
I would say that privately, there are a significant percentage of MPs, whilst not necessarily saying that Russia didn't do it, but at the same time, they are questioning the British government's argument. And these same MPs from a number of parties are fearful of taking a stand. Now, that is regrettable. We elect MPs to take a stand, but they are fearful because of the backlash that they will receive from British mainstream media. The language which is being used by British newspapers to describe anyone who's questioning the British case against Moscow is absolutely disgusting. Yep. We're hearing talk about traitors, we're hearing talk about useful idiots. So yes, there is truth. There are a number of MPs who privately think very differently, but regrettably, they're not going to say that publicly. So much for British democracy, I guess.
Unfortunately, part of the genetic code of professional politicians is cowardice. Alexander, let me go to you. A lot of people have said since this whole thing started, this is a gambit to derail Russia's World Cup that's coming up in a few months, to try to get some kind of, the international community will boycott it, meaning the Western countries, okay, NATO and American allies. Do you think that's part of this here? That's one of the reasons why it's being pushed so hard, without evidence, without the due process of law? Go ahead, Alexander.
Well, obviously, it's part of the game. I don't think it's the main part of the game. Obviously, there was an election in Russia before, and so on. But what I find absolutely ridiculous is that they are saying that Russia actually had a motive, and they use this word over and over again.
What is the motive? What is the motive?
Well, they're saying the motive is allegedly to strengthen the support or Putin's support in Russia. And I was responding to them and saying, do you actually believe that the Russian people are so bloodthirsty that they would unite behind the leadership if they see somebody getting poisoned of all places in Britain? And this sounds so bizarre, and it's being repeated by journalists and by politicians and by other people. Now, I think personally, what the biggest lesson we have from what is going on now in Britain is that the media here, the press, is out of control. There needs to be a reform of the media here, because what is happening, we have a tiny group of people controlling the whole of the British media, and nobody can do anything about it. And basically, from day one, the media already created the agenda.
Yep.
And in a sense, I even felt that the media boxed in some of the politicians.
Exactly.
And the politicians were afraid to say anything that would contradict the narrative. It's Russia, it's our enemy, Russia wants to destroy us.
Okay, well, it just proves to my guests here that lies and propaganda actually do sell well. All right, that's it. Many thanks to my guests in London and in Plymouth, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.